Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about one of the main enumerated powers of Congress, and that is the creation of the federal budget. So we'll be looking at what it takes to generate the budget, the process, as well as types of spending that the government has in terms of mandatory and discretionary spending. Now, something that has been very important in terms of how we generate a budget comes from the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974. This act created the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, and the budgeting process. So it created this OMB, which is part of the Executive Office of the President, and that is the budgeting arm of the president. So that really is almost like the president's accountant. And it's going to set forward how the budgeting process goes down officially to make it more streamlined and to make sure that one branch, Congress versus the president, doesn't get too much power or influence in this step. Now, the director of the OMB is, like I've said, basically the president's accountant. They consider the needs and the wants of federal departments and agencies, fiscal and economic policies of the president, federal revenues, and many other factors, actually. Now, this budget that is created for one fiscal year, and a fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 20th. Right? So we are currently looking into fiscal year 2020 for currently, I should say. Now, the budget is proposed first by the president. So the president, the executive branch, works with the OMB to develop a budget proposal. And then typically, this budget proposal is made public and will be sent to Congress in February. So it was actually just released for this coming fiscal year so that it can be finalized by the time the next fiscal year starts. And the president is influenced by a couple of things like outside interests, namely agencies. So departments and agencies will submit annual operating budgets showing what they need the money for, trying to influence the president to give them that money again or maybe increase it for certain projects. And interest groups as well. Interest groups can lobby the OMB to argue for the interests of the group they represent. Now, the final draft is sent then to Congress for consideration in committees. So the president is going to propose. It is ultimately up to Congress to kind of approve this. So just like a normal bill, it is then sent to committees to work. So these committees are called the Congressional Budget Committees, and they are in both chambers of Congress. And they examine the budget, and this kind of committee is a reaction to an issue of past presidents or a problem that past presidents created, where they would impound funds or refuse to spend the money that Congress had appropriated if the president disagreed with that type of spending. So this is kind of a way to check that power of the presidency. Now, while in the committee stages, legislative committees will hold hearings to listen to concerns of the constituents. And these legislative committees often have a particular area of focus, like education, transportation, the military. Interest groups will even use these hearings to press their budgetary needs. So maybe they would send an expert on their interests to educate legislatures before they vote, or another nonprofit interest group might bring someone in to testify that is directly impacted by their issue or focus. Committees will then take up appropriations bills for the coming fiscal year, meaning this is how much we as the committee believe should be spent on a particular issue. And ideally, these bills, appropriations bills, stay within the guidelines set by the budget resolution originally proposed by the president. Now, there is another piece to this, and it's very important, but it doesn't have too much of a say right now, but I did want to mention it, and that is the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. And this is the watchdog of congressional funds. It basically just keeps track of where and how all of this money is spent. And then finally, once the budget is passed in Congress, once it's gone through committees and then both chambers, it would then go back to the president for a signature. Now, Congress is also responsible for not only balancing the discretionary and mandatory spending, as we will see, they're also responsible for setting levels of revenues and expenditures. So, seeing how much money we need to take in versus how much money we actually need to spend or take out. They're responsible for setting the size of the budget surplus or deficit. So Congress is the only part of our government that can raise the deficit or debt spending or debt ceiling. And Congress is also responsible for spending priorities as well. Now, the question of the budget ultimately is, how do we pay for government costs? So for fiscal year 19, the one that we are still currently in, we needed $3.4 trillion in revenue. Okay, revenue, meaning what we need to take in, income, and usually we get this from taxes. So there are a couple of sources of this revenue that we get. The first would be the individual income tax, and that is paid by workers on the income that they make during the calendar year, and that varies based on income. So as you can see from this chart here, I know this is a little dated, but as you can see, this is the largest percent of revenue that our government gets, is from the individual income tax. Now, corporate taxes are paid by businesses on the profits they made during the calendar year. And then social insurance or payroll taxes are those taxes paid by both employees and employers to fund those entitlement programs that we've looked at, like Social Security, Medicare, unemployment. Now, tariffs and excises, taxes are tariffs, I'll start there, are taxes paid on certain imports or products to make US products cheaper. And then excise taxes are on specific products. Usually these are luxury products, alcohol, cigarettes, even gambling. And then there are other sources of revenue as well. That would be interest on government holdings or investments, estate taxes paid by people who inherit a very large amount of money, but this is pretty minimal compared to the others. Now, the budget for fiscal year 2019 is $4.4 trillion. Okay, and there are three categories of spending that the government has. The very first is mandatory. Now, mandatory spending is expenditures that are required by law or mandated for certain programs, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment. Now, mandatory spending for 2019 was expected to be $2.7 trillion, more than 60% of the federal budget. And as you can see here, that ultimately is echoed in this federal spending for fiscal year 2019. Now, another category of spending is interest on debt. And you may have noticed that the expected revenue for fiscal year 19 on the last slide was $3.4 trillion, but the expected spending budget-wise was $4.4 trillion. This difference between spending and revenue is the deficit. The government has to ultimately borrow money to pay that deficit, and each year's loans add on to the national debt that we have of $20 trillion. Now, the interest on this is huge. For example, in 2019, $363 billion, and that must be paid out of each year's revenue. Now, many consider this to be mandatory spending since the government must pay its creditors or we would risk default on a loan, and that could lead to serious financial crisis. Now, there is the final category of discretionary spending, and this accounts for 38% of fiscal year's 2019 budget. And this ultimately pays for everything else that is not those entitlement programs and those mandatory programs of the government. These are funds that the congressional committees debate and decide how to divide up, so those appropriations bills that I mentioned before. Now, as we'll see here in a moment, military spending is the largest category of discretionary spending. So here is the fiscal year 2020 proposed discretionary budget request. So as you can see here, President Trump has proposed defense spending, $718 billion. Other categories would be things like the interior, agriculture, transportation, housing and urban development, education is part in here as well. So this is kind of the money that can be allocated differently based on the congressional committees. Now, this is something that we have talked about in class prior to this, but I just want to give you guys a reminder here. Now, as you can see, this started in 1960. I know the date got cut off, but 1960 to 2020. As you can see, mandatory spending, which is on autopilot, this doesn't change, we have to spend this money, went from 26.1% of our budget to 64.2% of our budget today in 2020. So we've seen a very sharp increase in mandatory spending, whereas discretionary spending from 1960 started out as 67.5% of our budget, has now shrunk down to 24.4% of the budget. And this is why the increasing cost of things like Social Security is so alarming. Social Security, those entitlement programs are mandatory. As costs continue to grow, that leaves less money for these other programs and other needs. So as entitlement costs, just to summarize, as entitlement costs, those mandatory spending programs grow, discretionary spending has to ultimately decrease unless tax revenues increase, so we raise taxes, or Congress permits the budget deficit to increase. And this is where we often see political or ideological influences. Conservatives tend to argue that the tax burden is already significant on everyone, so social programs should be cut that are ultimately because those are responsible for those mandatory spending programs that cost so much. On the other hand, liberals tend to argue that the wealthier can bear a burden of higher taxes and those mandated programs serve a vital function. So we've kind of talked about this when we looked at policy, but there really is it's a catch-22, right? Either we increase taxes, which upsets people, or we cut funding or programs, which upsets people. So there really is a debate as to what to do in the future for the concern over these entitlement costs versus discretionary spending. Okay guys, so here are your summary questions for this video. We will talk about these in class, so make sure that you answer these, please, along with your notes. So you are summarizing the budget procedure that occurs each fiscal year and telling me how this is an example of checks and balances, and then fill in the blank. As entitlement costs grow, discretionary spending will decrease unless ... All right, so that is it for this video on Congress and the federal budget. Please take any questions that you have down to make sure you ask them in class, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.